This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Carleen Carey, a public educator with over 15 years of experience across K-12 and higher education sectors. Before founding Akoma Leadership Consulting, she served as Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Director of Public Outreach and Equity, College and Career Readiness Manager, and Instructor of Record for government, nonprofit, and higher education organizations. In these roles, she led a portfolio of programs, including Hidden Histories, EEOC Training Corner, Women's Leadership Lunch, and Community Coalition. In the K-12 sector, Dr. Carey led the transition to remote education for career and technical education teachers through professional workshops such as Race and Ability in the CTE Classroom, Tech Tune-Ups for CTE teachers, and Digital Download, connecting students with careers. She also taught Human Diversity, Power, and Opportunity in the Teacher Certification Program at Michigan State University. Dr. Carey currently teaches African American authors from 1700 to 1900, African American authors from 1900 to present, and early American literature at the University of Maryland Global Campus. In her free time, she enjoys quilting, raising chickens, and making jam. Hi, Dr. Carey. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing good. I'm so glad that I am able to speak with you today and that we can talk about the work that you do that I fortunately have been able to see a little bit more firsthand than some others over the past 15 years.
It's been quite some time. It has been quite some time. Thank you for the opportunity.
So we'll dive in. So how did you get into Black studies as a field, and what keeps you committed to doing the work of Black studies?
Sure. So I was first introduced to Black studies as a field when I was a grad student at Michigan State. So I was the youngest grad student in my cohort by about 10 years. And a lot of the folks who were in my cohort had already been principals or assistant principals, or at least had been in the classroom for quite some time. And those folks did not look like me. They were kind of wondering where I came from, how I turned up. And I remember one of the first things one of the ladies said to me was like, "Oh, I think you're the only Black person in our cohort." And I was like, okay, these Michiganders are a little bit different than the mess holes that I left behind at Williams College. That's different. And so when we finally got to class, I was like, okay, nope, she was right. There are no other Black people here. And of course, the cohort behind me had something like 9 Black people because the department chair had switched. And the person who was the department chair was like, that can't happen. Carleen's all by herself. Probably because I was in his office every other week. Like, hey, what's going on? I'm lonely. But I think what happened was there was a Black studies person that popped up in my class. And I want to say it was methods of qualitative research. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. There's an Africana Studies department on this campus. And of course, you know, when you're in a doc program, you have tunnel vision. You were focused on what's going on in your discipline, in your college, in your classes, what's your writing going to be like. That's it. And so I was like, oh no, there's an Africana Studies department. This is interesting. And through talking with, I think, Dr. Troutman, I was really interested in the work they were doing around mentoring Black girls. So I got involved with Daughters of the Collective. I met a few more people from the Black Studies department. And then I was like, you know, I think I could do this. And lo and behold, I ended up picking up a master's degree in the third year of a PhD program like a crazy person. Like, who does that? Thinking of it, I'm like, whoa, I was audacious. Look at me. But now I'm like, good Lord, honey, whoa, you really did it. But I was really excited by the fact that Black studies was applicable to little Black girls. Having had a Black girlhood, having understood that there are wonderful, wonderful things about being a Black girl. And then there are some challenges that I wish people a little further along the road had talked to me about. But it gave me the opportunity to see the research in a practical way and to apply it in my day to day life. Particularly because my master's thesis ended up being what my dissertation research was based on Black Cinderellas all over the world. So we're looking at Cinderellas in the US South, we're looking at Cinderellas in Haiti, we're looking at Cinderellas in South Africa, and we're asking ourselves the question, what's the similarities of these stories and how do Black girls make meaning out of these stories in terms of race and gender as writers and readers? So I really love Black studies because it connects the past to the present in such a fluid way. And there's nothing about Black studies that's not applicable when I wake up in the morning today in 2025. And I'm still seeing people push the boundaries of the field, looking at the work of Dr. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, thinking about what it means to look at her work, thinking about what it looks like to look at folks who are really pushing the boundaries of what does AI mean for Black women, right?
Mhm.
Like, let's take a look at what folks are doing, especially when we're thinking about the fact that Afrocentric theories of time are not linear. And I love that about us.
So I want to do a follow up,
Mhm.
right? So I know because we have had these conversations about AI and its usage and its utility, and also the challenges and problems around it. You are much more versed in AI than I am. Um, so, can you say a little bit more about like the impact of AI on Black women or the intersections between Black women and AI, particularly in this current moment in history that we find ourselves?
Whoo, buddy. Yes. I can. I can give you some of my thoughts, although I will have to let you know I am not the expert. I follow folks on LinkedIn like Timnit Gebru, who does really, really good work. And I make sure that I'm following people who are in the field. So I'm conversant, not an expert. But if you are thinking about Black studies and AI, one of the things that is a theme in Black studies is the recovery of voices, right?
Mhm.
And thinking about those voices, we're talking about Alice Walker and her work with Zora Neale Hurston. We're thinking about folks who do a lot of work around restoring the narrative and finding out which pieces of our history have been intentionally or unintentionally left out. Now, when we're dealing with AI, we have to think about who is programming these large language models, whose language is present, whose language is not, right?
Mhm.
And so when we're thinking about how these large language models get built, we have to consider the fact that tech is not something that is super accessible to most Black people. In a lot of ways, this is where the education system really falls short for Black students, particularly thinking about what are the investments that we make sure that students are digital natives, to make sure that they're conversant in things like coding, to make sure that they know, excuse me, to make sure that they know that this is a different opportunity to express yourself. So, how many ways are you going to express yourself? Are you going to write an app? Are you going to make code for programming? What are you going to do with this technology? And how do you use it to express yourself? The effect of that, of not having that sufficient training at the K 12 level, migrates right into higher ed, migrates right into the job market, where you have, wonderful organizations like POC and Tech, right? Who are doing the work of beating the drum of we need more representation. If Black people are 15% of the US population, why aren't we 15% of software engineers, of programmers, of data analysts, right? So the people who are in the room building the large language models are not representative of the US, right? So you have folks who do a lot of work around things like ethical AI, which is an interesting conversation to have, because when you're talking about the energy usage, when you're talking about the environmental pollution of running these large language models and how much water they use, how can you not talk about Flint, Michigan? Let's bring
Yeah.
it home. Let's bring it home. Because whose community is going to pay for these large language models going into use, and whose communities are going to benefit? Um, a lot of work that has been done in the tech world around thinking around about AI. And one of the most, I think, easiest ways to think about AI is to look at Calendly. The owner of Carleen is the only Black tech billionaire. Like, that's it. There's only one person. And of course, I don't want to put the responsibility on that one person of advocating for 15% of the American population. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself which communities are going to benefit the most and which communities are going to suffer, because we've already seen environmental racism happen as a result of all the environmental pollution of industrialization and how all the runoff into the river, all of this seems to affect Black communities the most. When I think about conversations about Black studies and AI, what I'm thinking about is if the people in the room creating the AI language models are not conversant in African American vernacular English, if they have no concepts of Afrocentric storytelling, if they have no sense of what it means to be an oral culture and not a written one, then that is all information that is getting completely left out, right? Completely. And so when you're using a large language model, you're using somebody else's perspective that didn't really have the idea that your experiences were important enough to value, to include, let alone center. So when I think about Black studies and AI, I think about a lot of the work of imagination, and the work that I do. The work that I do think about in imagination is, how do we imagine a different world? How do we imagine a world that is not the haves and the have-nots and the hierarchy that capitalism is so committed to? So I think a lot of the work that I think about when I'm thinking about Black studies and AI is, what new narratives do we get to write? And in what ways do we get to write ourselves into the text, a la Octavia Butler?
I was just about to say that. Octavia Butler. Okay, thank you. So coming from education and picking up a master's in Black studies along the way, and which I don't know that I actually knew that you formally picked up the master's. Just explain why we had so many classes together.
Girl.
And then the community work that you do with not only the things that you've done like outside of higher education and K-12, but also with the Akoma Leadership Consulting, and the work that you do even with different organizations in the community. So how would you situate yourself in relationship to both the academic fields and disciplines you've been trained in and the work that you're doing in the community?
Shout out and props to Ruha Benjamin. I would advocate that anybody interested in really understanding the impact of Black studies, take a look at her work. Because I went to a conference with her maybe 2 weeks ago. She was a keynote speaker, and I have been thinking about imagination ever since. For me, when I think about education as a discipline, especially for Black kids, we are already a fugitive. We know we are the Maroons. So even in colleges of education that advocate for, urban education and advocate for Black people to have the same opportunities and resources to education as everybody else, you can really understand that for a lot of people, the definition of Black education is not equality with whites, it's self-determination. And I didn't have that understanding until I went into the master's program. I was just looking at Black kids' histories and looking at W.E.B. Du Bois and the Brownies books and the history of children's literature, and it wasn't connecting for me that this institution and this discipline of education wasn't necessarily thinking about self-empowerment as the definition of, okay, this is effective education for Black children that works to help them, to chart the path that they're going to take through this world and to restory their own narratives and the narrative of their communities. So for me, a lot of the way that I situate myself is as an educator. I always wanted to be a teacher, even when I was little. But I also think that the work of education starts outside of the classroom. A classroom is a controlled environment. And when you do the work of Black studies, particularly with little Black girls, you are doing the work that people have not thought to do in a way that's really conducive to you and your questions and conducive to the work of the children, right? Because it's super interesting to be in an after-school book club with some 7th graders, and here I am with a roll of thunder, hear my cry. Woo, Lord. This I thought was The Color Purple for little black girls. Tell me why them kids was like, this is boring. My feelings was all kind of hurt. I was like, what do you mean this is boring? This is my favorite book. This is the book for really, nope. They didn't think it, they thought it was terrible. It was a bit slower, and it was a slow start for them, which for adolescent readers, pacing is key because you have to keep and hold their attention. Even though it was a classic black girl book, girl, my feelings was tore up. But the good news is that Sharon Flake, who had been a 7th grade middle school English teacher herself, her book, The Skin I'm In, and also I think Sharon Draper's Copper Sun. Oh, they loved Copper Sun so much because it tells a story from the perspective of starting in an African village and the fact that our protagonist has already been arranged to marry someone. Her father is chief in the village. There's social structure, there's family, there's all these things that white America's version of Black doesn't account for because they don't care about it, but But the girls themselves, I mean, they brought a lot of insights to the literature and the way they read literature that isn't necessarily paid a ton of attention to. Um, and let's think about my dissertation being in the early 2010s, right? So the field has changed a bit since then. And folks suddenly discovered that Black girls are fascinating, that they restory the world, and that they push back against all these narratives that are pushed on them. So for me, I think most of the work that I do in terms of working across disciplines comes because education is a social science, and when when we're looking at a social science, we kind of have to look at it in an intersectional way. I would say the intersection of literature. I don't get into rhetoric too much, but literature and education is probably where I find most of my inspiration for the work that I do with kids. And a lot of the work that I did led to the things I do now, like running PYTs on campus and showing up at, the K-12 college and community nights and letting kids know college is an option. Here are some ways that you can, here are some avenues you can take to think about, Upward Bound, to think about Trio, and those programs that I taught in when I was an undergrad, right? Because everybody wants to do teaching, well, maybe it's just me, because I always wanted to teach someone younger than me and figure out what the mentoring piece was. I think that's why Dr. Troutman's Daughters of the Collective program was so interesting to me, because I was like, oh, we're mentoring middle schoolers and undergrads as a grad student. And so I have always been involved in the community in a way that's very practical. And that has been really a huge benefit to me running Akoma, because much of the work that I do is focused on things like women's leadership, and how to lead authentically. Because a lot of folks know that, like, oh, leadership is banging your fist on the table and it's screaming at people and telling them they're fired. And I think the result that we see in American politics today is that that is chaotic. Okay. Not only is that bad for the person in leadership, that's bad for everybody around you because now you've set a toxic example of what it looks like to not be authentic to yourself and not to be authentic to the work of leadership, which is about helping other people. Does that make sense? I am definitely running across disciplines.
No, it definitely makes sense. And I think that, in if we think about Black studies as a whole, right? Like it is multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary or like what it has those cross sections, necessarily so, and being able to draw on the methods and strategies from different more traditional disciplines or what we consider to be disciplines is integral to exploring the questions and centering Black life. So no, that makes perfect sense. I'll come back to it. So I think that it's so interesting that you always wanted to be a teacher, right? And that the teaching is what brought you to Black studies. Not only because it was very similar to me, to my journey into Black studies, like the having a teacher who was like, I want to do this. Like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. So here I am. Um, how do you see the history in the field of Black studies as directly informing the work that you continue to do, right? So both the teaching that you do, even if it's outside of classroom spaces now, but also the work that you continue to do through Akoma and the other community organizations that you are a part of. And I know you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I want to invite you to expand on that if you'd like.
Sure thing. So when I think about the history of the field, it's really important to me that students, whether they're in the classroom or not in the classroom, are able to ask questions about where we've been and where we're going. So, one of the things that is important to me in my Black Studies classes, especially when I'm teaching Black literature from 1900 to the present, I am so delighted at the end of the course when students are writing their final papers and they are taking pieces of Langston Hughes, they're taking pieces of Du Bois, and they're putting it with Kendrick Lamar, and they're thinking about what does it mean to write a narrative of Black male life these days. And they're picking up on all of the hip hop artists that are their favorite, and they are writing that they've had the recognition that, oh, we've been writing about city life and urbanization for a long time, right? So students come away from my class feeling very much empowered to think about their history and who is still a part of that living history, as well as being an author of history. Because I'm really persistent about the historical narratives, and I'm really persistent about what are the modern themes? Where did this start? You did not fall out of the sky like a sunflower seed and suddenly get planted. We came from somewhere, and we have to understand where do our ideas come from when we're thinking about being a community, when we're thinking about what it means to be Black in America in this moment. And I do that because there's a lot of resources that we're taught to overlook in terms of our historical narratives. There are a lot of historical accounts that folks just don't take the time to sit down and read, like the Brownie books, right? I'm one of those people. I think I had the shock of my life when one of my students asked, and like, you don't sound like you from around here. I'm not from around here, honey. There's different shades of Black. And he sat down and he repeated it. He said, there's different shades of Black. I was like, see, look right here. Look right here. Who does it benefit for you to believe all Black people are the same? Nobody but the white supremacist and the colonizer. If we work from the idea that there are different shades of Black, then we understand James Baldwin and the queer community are having different experiences than folks who are not in the queer community, right? Let's take a look at Fannie Lou Hamer, who is farming by subsistence, right? Started the Freedom Farm Collective, one of my favorite ancestors, right? Who becomes a person whose work and life we can use at the NAACP community garden when we're teaching the kids about harvesting, when we're teaching kids about the connection between being able to feed yourself and political freedom. Because if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, Fannie Lou Hamer said it best. You can't control somebody who knows where their next meal is coming from. You can't. And I think one of the things that I find about the history of Black studies is that there are so many ways to resource yourself when you have an awareness of these narratives, and when you have awareness of what have been the accomplishments of your ancestors. And I know it's like super trendy to be very spiritual and talk about your ancestors. We have direct ancestors, yes, who are part of our blood lineage, and we also have cultural ancestors. So for students, at least my students in my after school book club, when I ask them things like, what do you like to read? What do you like to write? And the responses that I got, even from kids who were in 7th grade, are, oh, I hate that people think I'm being funny when I tell them I like to read. Like, they don't understand Black kids like to read. And I was like, oh, girly, let's do this. Whole chapter of a dissertation. Because the kids are more than aware and pushing back on society's views of them. And I think one of the ways that really helped me to think about history was like, oh, I wonder what it would be like to organize a book club where we have Black girls who are all reading Black women's literature. Because I came to Black women's literature pretty much as an undergrad. I didn't have any Black studies classes in high school. And it was just something that was like, okay, well, if you're going to be an English major, you're going to read mostly old white people God bless the old white people, but if it wasn't for Toni Morrison's The Self of Source Regard, I was like, listen, I would have been lost. I would not have had the resources that my cultural ancestors, that my foremothers as literature scholars, as teacher educators, just like here in Baltimore, Coppin State, Fannie Jackson Coppin was the first, okay? And a long legacy of Black women who are educators. And I take a lot of strength from her narrative. And in the way that that makes sense for me is to also give that strength, give that resource, give those strategies to the folks who are in my classroom, whether the classroom is in the garden or whether the classroom is online at the university.
So I'm going to build on that because I do know, right? Some of
So,
the creative aspects of your life and even in your bio, right? Like quilting, making jam, raising chickens. And I know that there are many connections to the work, the more I don't wanna say physical, but the work that you do with your hands, right?
mhm.
And the lineage of ancestors, both bloodline and cultural. And so I wanna invite you to say a little bit about some of how the work that you do that's outside of what we typically consider to be academic work or even teaching, right? How that also connects you to the field or is influenced by the field of Black studies and your commitment to the ancestral lines that we come from.
Well, honey, you know Booker T. Washington was a quilter, right?
I didn't.
We go way back. As Black people, we go way back when it comes to making something out of nothing. So I'll start with my family. My dad's mom was an avid quilter, and she taught me to quilt when I was in college. I think I had really figured out that all of this creativity cannot be even handled by academia because it's not designed to be. Academia is about what is your brain doing? And in large part, it can divorce your brain from your body, your mind from your spirit, right? And so I think I came into quilting wanting to mend literally some of that divide, but also busting out of my ears with creativity and wondering where it could go. So, like, thinking about the work that my grandma started me on this path, Lord have mercy. Even though she was like, we had very different ideas of quilting, because for her, she was a very, very traditional quilter. And when we think about quilting in the Black community, she was born in 1924, right? So think about the Depression and think about the fact that even before the Depression hits white people, American society keeps Black people in a depressed economic state for their own benefit.
Mhm.
She made quilts that were patchwork quilts, which are very traditional. But when I look at her patchwork quilts now, I'm looking at a piece of somebody's jeans. I'm looking at curtains. I'm looking at a shirt. I'm looking at a tea towel. I'm looking at the original upcycle, okay? Which was use what you have to make what you need, right? And so when we think about quilting in that family traditional sense, a lot of it is about holding the pieces of my ancestors and my family that I've only heard stories about. Like, my dad has always been super impressed with the fact that my grandma can turn out a quilt in the afternoon, and she does it really quickly. She quilts by hand for the most part. She was surprised to find that I had a sewing machine. She was like, "You have a whole machine? You don't do it with your hands?" "No, I don't." I used to shock her sometimes, like, "Grandma, look at this fabric I got." She was like, "You bought fabric from the store to make a quilt?" Like, the idea of spending girl, we had some conversations about that. She was like, what's wrong with your bed sheet? Why you have to buy all this fabric for the back of the quilt? You could have just used your bed sheet." Because that's what they did. When I look at her quilts now, there are so many pieces of my family. My dad has 4 brothers, okay? So there's plaid, there's so many, like, just shirts and pockets and stuff like that on her quilts. And I'm glad that she was able to pass those on to me and that I got the chance to learn from an expert how to quilt. Um, a lot of the work that I think, for me, quilting holds is the ability to shape your imagination and the ability to see what happens when you let your imagination run wild. When my grandmama and them were quilting, Girl, it was a whole social event. And I could never understand why she was like, "Who quilts with you? Who's quilting your quilt with you?" Until I saw those, because she always thought quilting and jamming were like community events. She was always wondering what I was doing by myself. I was like, "What is going on here?" But her idea of quilting spent like a Friday night, people come over to can and people come over to quilt because you don't finish a quilt by yourself. When you've got the top, the batting, and the backing on, and you have it put together, the last part of a quilt is doing the actual top stitching for the quilt and putting the binding on. And those are things that people can gather around a quilting frame and do. Because traditionally in the Black community, the quilting frame is built by a dude, utilizes carpentry skills, those sorts of things, and it can be remade from things like furniture that's broken, right? So a lot of the work that people do with quilting is in community, especially when we're looking at things like, or when I was looking at the Quilters of Gee's Bend documentaries, and I saw for the first time what it looks like to quilt in community. I was like, oh, that's what she was talking about. All her friends over here, everybody quilting on the quilt, and they over here singing hymns. Girl, yes, because my grandma was a Sunday school teacher too. So one of the things I really love about thinking and I think that's also the thing that I love the most about Black Studies, it is practical each and every day. Like, you can wake up and go to your refrigerator, open up a jar of jam that you canned yourself from fruits that you grew yourself. I have a strawberry tower in my garden right now, okay? Because come August, traditionally, I'm a country mouse from Virginia, Westmoreland, in fact, August is canning time. That's when everything that you planted in the early spring is ready. And I think one of the things that was really a solid memory that I'm holding on to is just being able to take my grandma some of my jam and she'd be like, "Oh, you got it right. This is a good one." Or like, "Oh no, you used too much sugar this time." I was like, "Oh." Because even though she had dementia at the end of her life, she could remember the things that she did habitually, like how to get the skins off of grapes when you're making grape jam. I was like, "Grandma, this chicken is not coming out right. I put so much seasoning on it. It doesn't taste like anything." She's like, "Did you put any bacon grease on it before you put the seasonings in it?" "No, I didn't." But I will, right? So in a lot of ways, Black Studies for me is about reclaiming those narratives, those resources and strategies that our family gave us, but also that our culture gave us. Because when we're thinking about how to do the work of surviving in America and hell, even thriving in America, right? This has been done before. We just have to do two things. Number one, remember. Number two, reactivate. Because a lot of the work that quilters do nowadays, and let's be very clear that quilting was one of the ways that Black families were able to support themselves during Reconstruction after the U.S. government did not give an economic floor to the Black community. Martin Luther King Jr. was very right about that, right? I think one of the things that we have to remember about quilting is that, yes, it's a way to economic freedom. It's also a way to keep the pieces of your loved ones in the family, to keep the family's narratives together, and to remind our young people, you came from somewhere and you are someone. You have resources and skills that were gathered for you by previous generations that you can use to make a quilt to keep yourself warm, number one, make quilts to sell. And then the other part is you have all these recipes, food recipes and non-food recipes that come through your family that are amazing places to start when you think about being able to sustain yourself when there's no food in the grocery store, right? Because how quickly are people going to give up their rights if there's no food to be had? Think about a lot of the work that Black Studies does, at least for me. I love it because it's always applicable in every circumstance. It has to be interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, and it has to center the voices of people who haven't been heard.
Thank you. I think that was, I know that was a question that kind of sprung on you, but I really appreciate where you took it. I think that it's right now, especially, those reminders are so necessary. And even things like the blunt honesty of a grandmother. Because my grandmother also very honest. Nah, Ash, this ain't Ain't it?
Try this one again.
I'm gonna need you to add.
Yep.
Um, yeah, and but those things stick with us.
They
And
do.
you remember, right? Like, now you know, nope, I got to put bacon grease in first
Mhm.
because grandmother would not approve. I was making one of my grandma's recipes yesterday, and it's like, okay, just don't trying to make sure it gets to where she would have had it.
Mhm.
Because that was and then and the connection, right, to all of our ancestors and our cultural ancestors, right? Like, that recipe is something she learned from her mother, who she probably learned it from her mother, or at least from the community that they came from in Mississippi before my grandparents migrated north. Having those connections and then being able to teach those things to my daughter is something that's so important to me. And even just the core memories that it unlocks, um, I think is so helpful to remember right now
Mhm.
in the midst of all of the things. So,
Even if the only reminder is that there have always been a lot of things, yet and still, there's a family who loves you. The way that you approach the work and do your work matters, and there's a community of support behind you.
mhm. And those strategies are there, even if there are new tools, like your grandmother didn't understand you using a machine to help with your quilt. But it's possible, right? In a way that might not have been possible for her when she started. She had her way of doing it, but you both produce quilts and you both are able to weave the narratives and the histories of your family together using different tools.
Yes, and I need to clarify. So, the thing that really confused her was not that I had a machine because I have her mother's sewing machine. It was the fact that I could only quilt on a machine. And she was like, "What?" Because when she got a quilting machine, or when she got a sewing machine, quilting went even faster. But she was really fast with her hands, and she didn't understand why I'm not a hand quilter. Like, if you ask me to hand quilt something, I'm gonna be like, "Okay, let me call somebody for you. I got a reference. I got some people who can do that." But one of the things that was really, I think, important about her being surprised that I couldn't hand quilt is she was like, "Well, let me get you a thimble and I'll show you how to do it. Watch." Because this is how Black kids learn
Mhm.
traditionally, culturally. You do not write things down, okay? You watch and you practice with an elder in the community. And so for her, she was so frustrated that my stitches were always crooked and they were never the same size. And she was like, "Oh, you need to take your time. Take your time. You can do it, but you need to take your time. I don't understand why you rush." I was like, but she could never understand. But I was like, but when I bought her quilts that I had done on my sewing machine, she was like, "Oh, this is such nice stitching. Look what you've done here." I was like, "Thanks, because that's definitely not coming from my hand quilting." Um, and actually hand sewing and stuff like that, I learned that in quilting communities with other Black women, like the sewing circle at church, or I'm headed down to a conference in a couple weeks called Kindred Spirits. And a lot of the ladies at Kindred Spirits are Black women who love quilting. But because quilting has been extremely commercialized, extracted, and commodified, typically when you go to a quilting expo or a quilting show or workshop, it's white women of leisure.
Mhm.
And it's nothing wrong with white people quilting, but at the same time, if you want the experience of being in a room with Black elders who are teaching you how to hand quilt, you have to look specifically for that. And you have to be very, very diligent about learning how to quilt from other Black women. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
It does make a lot of sense. So thank you.
You as well?
So you have touched on this, but I'm just going to ask, would you like to add anything that interests you about the past of Black studies, both in critical and excited senses. So even if, right, so we've talked a lot about the influence and impact of Black studies on the everyday life
Mhm.
and how um, the the embodying Blackness, as well as knowing where that came from and where in acknowledging all of the people and time and recipes that went into making you who you are today. Um, that is definitely Black studies in the past and in integral to understanding the field. But are there things about the field of Black studies that maybe we should think about more critically or recognize that maybe need to have shifted and maybe need to continue to shift as we move forward, particularly in this moment?
That's a really good question. I think what gives me a lot of hope about the future of Black studies is the work of Ruha Benjamin, specifically, when we're
Mhm.
like viral justice.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I love about her work is that it forces us to think about whose imagination are we living in and whose imagination would we prefer to live in, right? I really think that the work of Black studies, particularly when we're looking at technology, and particularly when we're looking at history, right? There's a lot of opportunity to restory and tell a better narrative about the Black community, what our achievements have been, what our shortcomings can be, and what are the things we need to do to overcome everything that the world is throwing at us these days. Um, for me, a lot of the work in that Ruha Benjamin does around justice and is America ever going to give Black people justice? And I say give very, very intentionally, because the work of Nicole Hannah Jones tells us that Black people have been more committed to the American ideal of equality, freedom, and justice for all than anybody else.
Mhm.
Like, period. But I am super excited about the work of Black studies when it comes to thinking about justice, thinking about freedom, and thinking about ways to practice um, our versions of freedom a little bit every day or all at once, like Asada Shakur. Shout out to Cuba, honey. A lot of the work that folks are doing, I think, these days in Black studies gives me a lot of hope, particularly around the work of Dr. Janine Staples. In one of my jobs, I'm a systems designer. Well, through Akoma, really. I'm a systems designer with Penn State Dickinson Law. And so that means I get to do things like teach workshops on systems design with law professors and things like that. But it also put me in contact with Dr. Staples over lunch very, very suddenly. And if you've never had the opportunity to tell a Black professor to her face that you quoted her in your dissertation, I recommend it. I really, really do. She lit up like a Christmas tree. She was like, "You what?" I was like, "Yes." And I explained a bit to her about my work in my dissertation and work with Black girls. But one of the things I think is most exciting to me, particularly about Black studies and the future of Black studies, is looking at how those narratives that have been discounted and counted out, like little Black girl narratives, right? How those come into contact with opportunities to do things like rethink about AI and how do we create a world that gives Black girls their due and not just the leftovers of everyone else.
That part.
That was a good question.
That was a great answer. So thank you. Is there anything that you would like to add?
Everybody needs to read Ruha Benjamin immediately, if not sooner, you know? And everybody needs to really go put your hands in something creative, whether your creativity comes out in quilting or in cooking or in gardening, whether it comes out in designing video games, whether it comes out in writing, whether it comes out in carpentry. The world really is your canvas. And when you look through a Black studies lens, you start to see how many different textures of that canvas you can start to paint And if you start looking at the history of Black studies, you're like, oh my God, not only are there so many shades of Black, but girl, I get to make my own. Love it. And I love that for us.
I love that for us too. And I think that that is a perfect place to end for today. So, thank you so much for all of your insight and knowledge and just for being your amazing self, Dr. Carey. I
Oh,
really appreciate your presence in my life and on this podcast. So, thank you.
you are most welcome.